Well, good morning, everyone. It's a bit of a strange time. We're still here in Australia, and we're in some ways happy to be here to spend more time with people we love. But we desperately look forward to getting back to you guys in Ballina as well. And one day, hopefully not too distant future, when we're back in Australia next time, I look forward to meeting those out in Merriwa. One of the great advantages of being back here is that Brooke and I love spending time in the Australian bush. You spend a bit of time outside of Australia and you recognise how unique and special Australian wildlife is. I remember a time quite a few years ago when we went on a youth group camp down to the Shoalhaven River, which is a couple of hours south of Sydney. And we went for a walk, and while we were walking down in the field next to the river, there were these giant holes everywhere in the field. I wonder if those in Ireland listening know what the animal was that was responsible for these giant holes. Everyone in Australia will tell you straight away it was wombats. The sign of wombats being there was all around us. You couldn't miss it. And sure enough, by waiting just a little while, before too long, we were able to see some of these amazing creatures wandering about in the field there. Brooke and I, when we went to a place on holidays called the Barrington Tops, we were told, and part of the reason we chose this place was that in the river right there was some platypuses living. So Brooke and I went down to the river and we looked around and we could not see any signs of platypuses. No signals that they were even there, nothing, no evidence whatsoever. We waited and we looked and we waited and we looked. And nothing. We never saw a platypus. We just had to take that promise as being true. There really were platypuses there, even if we didn't see them. Well, this morning, as we begin the book of Esther, I want us to think about the hidden hand of God. And I want us to start by asking two questions. Let me ask them of you. What would you need to see to believe that God is at work here in Heathcote, Engadine? What would you need to see to believe that God is at work here in Ballina, here in Merriwa? That's the first question. And the second one is, what signs would you need to see to believe that God is at work right now in this coronavirus crisis? What would you need to see to believe? Let me begin by praying, and then we'll spend some time looking at the opening chapters of Esther. Father, thank you so much for your word. Thank you that you are at work even now, and that you speak to us through this ancient story of Esther. So we ask this morning that you would give us ears to hear, that you would give us minds to understand, that you would give us a heart that is shaped and changed by your word. Grow our faith. Help me to speak clearly. Please may your truth be made known this morning. Amen. Well, as we begin in chapter 1 of Esther, we're going to have 3 points this morning. You'll see them up on the screen behind me. We're going to look at me leadership. We'll see that God's people were weak exiles, and we'll also finish by looking at God's silent sovereignty. So first up, in chapter 1, look at me leadership. King Xerxes, or King Ahasuerus, as the Jewish would call it, was the king of the Persian Empire. And the writer of Esther wants to see that this was not just any empire, this was the world power of the day. Verse 1 tells us that his territory went from Ethiopia to India. This was huge. It was over 127 provinces. This is the world power of the day. And Xerxes ruled over the Jews. Esther took place during the exile. The temple in Jerusalem had been rebuilt, and lots of Jews had returned to Judah and to Jerusalem. But the story makes it clear that there's still many Jews living as exiles, living under Persian rule. So what was the rule of Xerxes like? Well, we're told that it was very much a look at me kind of leadership. Look at me leadership. Xerxes sat on his royal throne in the citadel in Susa, And he wanted everyone to see the obvious signs of his power and majesty. "Look at me," says Xerxes. Verse 3. In the 3rd year of his reign, he gave a banquet for all his nobles and officials. The military of Persia and Media, the princes and the nobles of the provinces were present. For a full 180 days, he displayed the vast wealth of his kingdom and the splendor and glory of his majesty. This is opulence and excess. This is lots of bling and lots of drinking. Verse 7 tells us, wine was served in goblets of gold, each one different from the other, and the royal wine was abundant in keeping with the king's liberality. The wine was flowing. The king was saying, "Look at me." And even his wife, Queen Vashti, becomes just another shiny thing for the king to show off. Verse 11 tells us that the drunken king ordered his officials to bring before him Queen Vashti, wearing her royal crown in order to display her beauty to the people and nobles, for she was lovely to look at. But when the attendants delivered the king's command, Queen Vashti refused to come. Now this, friends, is a humorous and awkward moment in the story. This powerful king of the known world, and here he is being refused by his own wife. It's an awkward moment. I wouldn't want to be the official who told the king, "Your Majesty," the queen said, she said, "Pardon? Your Majesty." She said she wouldn't come. The king's pride is dented. The king is furious. And the result is that Queen Vashti is sacked. She's removed. She's banned from ever coming into the king's presence again. And the wheels are set in motion for Queen Vashti to be replaced by a younger, beautiful replacement. And we learn later on that this shiny young replacement queen will be the young Jew, Esther. Now, before we stop and turn Queen Vashti into some kind of hero of the feminist movement, before we say that about her, or alternatively, before we argue that she was a foolish and disobedient wife and she deserved what she got, before we do either of these, we need to remember that this story, as with most Old Testament stories, is not focused on the morals. It's not focused on whether Queen Vashti was right or wrong, whether she was a hero or a bad wife. This is not about Queen Vashti at all. In fact, this story instead is painting a picture of what the world's leadership is like, what worldly leadership looks like, and it's very much a look at me leadership. Here we see it as grotesque, the vain pride, the dehumanizing power dynamics, the excess, the pomp. This is look at me leadership. Persia was visible and impressive, and Xerxes was too. And yet chapter 1 gives us readers a clever little insight, an important little insight as we are invited to laugh at this ridiculous story of royal disobedience. And we're invited to realize that for all its impressive, visible power, this look at me leadership is not as strong as it seems. And friends, that is an important lesson for us to learn. For all the impressive and visible power in the world around us today, for all the look at me leaders, for all the social influences, for all of the right side of history movements, maybe they're not as strong as they seem. Maybe they're not as important as they seem. Well, that brings us to our second point, looking at weak exiles. See, if chapter 1 is a focus on worldly power, then chapter 2 focuses on weakness. It's in chapter 2 that God's people, the Jews, enter the picture, and they enter as weak and hated exiles. Verse 5 of chapter 2. Now there was in the citadel of Susa a Jew of the tribe of Benjamin, named Mordecai, son of Jair, the son of Shimei, the son of Kish, who had been carried into exile from Jerusalem by Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, among those taken captive. This is a story of exiles. We're told that Mordecai was carried into exile, that he was taken captive. And this is a story of exiles. It's referring to probably Mordecai's family rather than Mordecai himself, otherwise he would be very, very old. But the point stands, the Jews, Mordecai and his family, were a people of exiles. To be an exile was to be weak and vulnerable. You don't belong. You don't have rights. You don't have power. You're certainly not the ones influencing culture and law. You're captives to it. And it's worth noting that the word Jew here is not primarily a racial or national term. It's a religious term. Here it's describing those who belong to Yahweh, those who are members of God's covenant people. And so we as Christians today are grafted into this exile people. And in many ways, if you're a Christian, then your life faces some of the same challenges. The Apostle Peter tells us exactly that in 1 Peter chapter 2. He says, "Dear friends, I urge you as foreigners and exiles to abstain from sinful desires which wage war against your soul. You live such good lives among the pagans that though they accuse you of doing wrong, they may see your good deeds and glorify God on the day he visits us." Peter is clear, friends, that if you are a Christian, you belong to Christ. Your life is hid in him. And so this world is not ours. We're not in charge of cultural norms. We're not in charge of the prevailing standard of morals of the day. We're not in charge of what is legal and illegal. We instead seek to live a life of faithfulness to God. And we do so recognizing that in many ways we are living in enemy territory. You are in the world, but you don't belong to the world. Well, as Esther is introduced, we're given a further picture of vulnerability, of weakness. Have a look with me at verse 7 of chapter 2. Mordecai had a cousin named Hadassah, whom he brought up because she had neither father nor mother. This young woman, who was also known as Esther, had a lovely figure and was beautiful. Esther is a picture of vulnerability here. Now, there's a children's Christian TV show called Veggie Tales. Perhaps you've heard of it. It tells Bible stories using talking vegetables and lots of very funny, silly songs, which my kids love, thrown in as well. And the Veggie Tales version of Esther is called The Girl Who Became Queen. It's a fun and romantic, very much child-friendly story. But the real biblical story of Esther is anything but that. It's a sad story. It's a shocking story. And it shows the vulnerability, weakness, and exploitation of this young Jewish woman. In verse 1, King Xerxes' fury at Vashti had subsided, and he's getting a bit lonely, and so he's happy when his attendant suggests, why don't we hold a competition to find a replacement queen? And verse 12 of chapter 2 paints a disturbing picture of this queen-finding competition. Verse 12. Before a young woman's turn came to go into King Xerxes, she had to complete 12 months of beauty treatments prescribed for the woman, 6 months with oil of myrrh, and 6 with perfumes and cosmetics. And this is how she would go to the king. Anything she wanted was given her to take with her from the harem to the king's palace. In the evening she would go there, and in the morning return to another part of the harem. These women were very much treated as property. 6 months with this oil, 6 months with this perfume to get them ready for not a beauty competition. No, each young woman, we're told, was to spend the night with the king and to try to please him. The vulnerability and exploitation of Esther is clear, and it highlights for us the vulnerability and weakness of God's people. God's people are exiles, and by the world's measures of power, they are incredibly vulnerable, incredibly weak. In fact, as the story unfolds, we see that not only are God's people weak exiles, they are hated exiles. In verse 10, we read that before Esther enters the palace, Mordecai warns his young cousin not to reveal who she really is, not to reveal her family heritage, but instead to hide her Jewishness. And friends, this was for good reason. The Jews are a hated people. We'll see that in much more detail next week as we meet Haman in chapters 3 and 4. So tune in again next week to see that fleshed out. But God's people, both then in Esther's time and now, some 2,500 years later, are a weak and hated people. We are exiles. So if you thought you could rely on this world's visible and impressive power to come to your rescue, if you thought you could rely on the world's government or cultural trends or systems of morality to work in a Christian's favour, then I think you are sadly mistaken. And if you're waiting for the good old days to return, you know, the days when the church seemed to be more influential and respected, when Australia's or Ireland's values were much more Christian, if you're waiting for those times to return, then I suspect you're in for a disappointment. Christians are exiles. God's people are exiles. We are in this world, but we are not of it. This brings us to our third and final point. See, as sad and shocking as this one night with the king competition is, it serves as more than a picture of weakness and exploitation. It shows us God's hidden hand at work, his silent sovereignty. Verse 17. Now the king was attracted to Esther more than any of the other women, and she won his favour and approval more than any of the other virgins. So he set a royal crown on her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. Esther pleases the king more than any of the other women, and she wins the competition, and hooray, she's crowned as queen. Well, we feel like cheering, and if it was a fairy tale, we would cheer at this result. But this is no fairy tale. Remember what it is that Esther has actually won. She's become the replacement for the previous queen, who was ousted for daring stand up and have an opinion of her own. Esther's win is not one to cheer for. This is not a position of power. And yet, almost immediately, the writer points our attention to the way God will use this strange turn of events for his purposes. Verse 21. During the time Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate, Bigthana and Teresh, two of the king's officers who guarded the doorway, became angry and conspired to assassinate King Xerxes. But Mordecai found out about the plot and told Queen Esther, who in turn reported it to the king, giving credit to Mordecai. And when the report was investigated and found to be true, the two officials were impaled on poles. All this was recorded in the book of the annals in the presence of the king. Mordecai is in the right place at the right time to overhear a plot to kill the king. What a coincidence. And Mordecai is able to pass this information on to the king via his cousin, Esther, who just so happens to be the new queen. What a coincidence. And Esther and Mordecai, the stage is set for them to now have some sort of influence at least, some sort of favour from this tyrant king. What a coincidence. But of course, it's not really a coincidence at all, is it? No. Albert Einstein said that all coincidences are just God's way of staying anonymous. And God stays anonymous throughout the book of Esther. Had you noticed that yet? That his name hadn't popped up at all in the opening couple of chapters. In fact, God's not mentioned anywhere in the book. No dreams, no vision, no prophecy, no prayer, nothing. Is this an oversight of the writer? Well, no. The book is actually all about God. And by not mentioning him, the writer is inviting us as the reader to look for his hidden hand at work. We're asked to find how the God of the universe, who created and sustains all things by his powerful word, we're asked to find how is he acting now in this story. Where is God's silent sovereignty? And more than that, this God of the universe has made big promises to his people. And so we're invited to ask, how is he keeping these promises? And the answer is that God is acting and ruling and keeping his promises in the same way he usually does throughout human history. Not through a string of visible and impressive signs, but rather through completely ordinary day-to-day events. Already in Esther, we've seen a string of coincidences. A drunken king who boasts, a self-respecting queen who refuses, a beauty pageant with a sensuous Jewish girl, an overheard plot. All these coincidences, and yet God will use them, all of them, to save his people. Humans are often obsessed with appearances. We want things to be impressive and important and powerful and obvious. We opt for look-at-me leadership far too often. But God is less concerned with appearances and more concerned with his sovereignty. And so he often acts with a silent sovereignty, a hidden hand, powerfully at work, but not obvious to see. American pastor Timothy Keller says this: "When you see one of the 10 plagues, you know that's God. But when King Xerxes gets drunk and starts bragging, you don't say, 'Wow, there's God at work.'" But the book of Esther is trying to tell you, don't make that mistake. God is at work. Last week, we here considered the Easter story, and we saw that many made that exact mistake with Jesus. They wanted a Messiah, but Jesus didn't fit their paradigm, their expectations of what this Messiah would look like. They wanted a mighty king who came with impressive power and lifted Israel up to have the influence they once had. And instead, there was Jesus bleeding and dying on a Roman cross. How could God possibly be at work through this slain lamb? And yet he was at work for your salvation. Paul says, Jews demand signs and Greeks look for wisdom, but we preach Christ crucified. The book of Esther urges you, look for God's hidden hand. Trust in his silent sovereignty. The King and Saviour, he is at work even now, even here. At the start, I asked 2 questions. What would you need to see here in Heathcote, Engadine, in Ballina, in Merriwar, to believe that God was at work? What would you need to see? And what signs would you need to see to believe that God was at work even now during this coronavirus crisis? Would it need to be something big and impressive? Would it need to grab your attention? Would the church need to do something that everyone notices in some big and amazing way and pats us on the back? Or is it possible that right now God might be working in not obvious and impressive ways, but rather through a message that seems like foolishness? A man hanging on a cross to save the world. Is it possible that God's at work through humble, broken people, weak and ordinary people like me and like you? Should we pray for God to do big things? Well, yes, of course. But the book of Esther tells us to also have eyes of faith that see God's hand at work right here and now, in the so-called coincidences, in the very mundane and ordinary moments and people. His sovereignty is often more like a platypus than a wombat. Not obvious signs that it's even there. No big display that he's at work. Hidden. Sometimes completely silent. But gloriously beautiful.